Hello, I'm Philip Sales. In this video I'm interviewing David Natzler, the Senior Clerk in the House of Commons Public Bill Office. David, what is the House of Commons Public Bill Office?
It's an office of clerks and officials, that is, in the House of Commons who deal with the passage of all legislation through the House of Commons.
Can I begin by asking you some basic questions about the way Parliament works?
Please.
Is there a new Parliament elected at each general election?
That is what a general election effectively does. It elects a whole new slate of members of Parliament and members of the lower House of Commons.
And what is the life of a Parliament?
Well, the maximum life of a Parliament is 5 years, and that's a statutory limit, but it lasts until and unless the Parliament is dissolved.
And how is it dissolved?
It's dissolved by an act of the Queen, an act of prerogative on the advice of her Prime Minister, and that brings on another general election.
What is a session of Parliament?
A session of Parliament is the period between prorogations, which sounds obscure but isn't meant to. It normally lasts a calendar year. It's started by a Queen's speech and it's ended by prorogation, which brings the session to the end and has in particular the effect of ending all the legislation then in progress that hasn't been agreed by both houses.
So is there a Queen's speech at the start of each session of Parliament?
That is a very strong convention now, although technically not a necessity.
And what is the Queen's speech?
Queen's speech is an opportunity for the government, through the mouth of the monarch, to lay out the legislative programme for the session ahead, so as originally to tell the nation, which may have had an idea already now as a result of leaks or draft bills already published, but to give people an idea of what it is the government intends to put through both houses in the session ahead.
What happens to a bill which is still making its way through Parliament when a general election is called?
It dies. And therefore, at the end of each Parliament, as we just saw in April, there's a frantic attempt to salvage those bits of legislation that can be salvaged that are going through but haven't completed passage through both houses.
And how can they be salvaged?
Usually by very, very major surgery, lopping off large bits of it, because they're only going to get through if everybody in both houses agrees to them.
And is this what is called the wash-up?
That is called the wash-up, absolutely.
What happens to a bill which is still making its way through Parliament when a session comes to an end?
Well, prorogation also, as I say, has the effect of killing off bills, so they also die. Under procedures recently introduced, they can, in the House of Commons, be revived by a motion if notice has been given in the previous session that that's the proposition. So each year now, about 3 or 4 bills, or no more than that, are revived in the new session, so that all the work that was done on them in the previous session is not wasted.
Can we turn to the role of officials, clerks, in the Public Bill Office in Parliament? Are there separate offices for the House of Commons and the House of Lords?
Very much so, and you will be seeing my colleague Sarah Jones from the Lords Public Bill Office.
When the government wants to take a bill through Parliament, how does the Public Bill Office first become involved?
Well, the offices of both houses will first become aware of it in very much the same way as everybody else, by reading the manifestos if it's a general election year, or by reading the newspapers of what's likely to come. But the first thing that formally that we get to see, or that I get to see, is a longish letter from Parliamentary Council setting out what the bill's going to do and asking a number of more or less technical questions about it, to which answers are required.
And who is Parliamentary Council?
Parliamentary Council are the government's draftsmen. They're the people who actually write the bills.
And what are you asked about when you receive this letter from them?
Well, a number of things conventionally, different things for different bills, different puzzles, if you like. Not legal puzzles in themselves, because we're not lawyers, but matters to do with parliamentary procedure and practice. One area where we're asked questions is about money, because there are special procedures dealing with the impact that bills have on expenditure and on taxation, and different resolutions are required, and the bits of the bills that affect people in that way, that's to say impose a charge on the public, or lead directly to expenditure, may be italicised if in the Commons, that's to say printed in italics, but also a resolution is passed to cover that sort of expenditure. We're asked about hybridity.
Now what is that?
Well, hybridity is a sort of elephant in the room. It's the constant fear that by mistake you're introducing under the guise of a public bill what should have been introduced as a private bill, because it is a bill that affects people of the same class but in a different way.
And what is the significance if a bill is found to be a hybrid?
If a bill is found to be hybrid by the examiners, as they're called, who are officials like myself, if they find that it is hybrid, then it proceeds as if it was a private bill, And from the government's point of view, the main problem is delay, because the bill will then be will be subject to being petitioned against by those who feel they have been unfairly treated and singled out, if you like. So within a particular class, they are not getting, they are being disadvantaged. So that is going to cause delay and may well lead to the bill being lost.
So will Parliamentary Council make every effort to ensure that it's a public bill then?
That is part of their skill, is to ensure they can do what they want while avoiding hybridity.
And what other things are you asked about?
I'm also asked about the need for what's called Queen's or Prince of Wales's, but mainly the Queen's consent. It's a largely technical issue concerned with the prerogative of the Crown being affected, or her private interest, which the Crown does also have in some things. But that's largely technical. We're normally asked about the titles of the bill. That sounds a very small point. A bill has a long title, not a very long title, maybe 100 words, and a short title. The long title is not usually, it's a description so far as possible as to what's in the bill, which is of particular interest in the Lords. The short title tends to be of some interest sometimes to politicians. They would quite like to introduce bills called a Making Everything Better bill, whatever, and we say, I'm afraid it's not meant to be a slogan, it's meant to be a purely objective description in as few words as possible that sums up what the bill is about as a whole, and there can be a little quiet negotiation has to go on about that. And finally, I'm asked about scope. That is to say, the government, ministers that is, and their officials are always interested in advance as to how widely amendments may be selected to the bill as being within scope. That's to say, in America it's called germane, how far they're relevant to the subject matter of the bill as a whole. So they will inquire. And for example, the energy bill, of which you will see some clips, there might have been an issue as to how far wider amendments about climate change might be allowed in, how far in discussing fuel poverty. It wouldn't just cover the electricity and gas, which are the normal energy sources used in fuel poverty schemes, but might cover people the many people who use liquid fuels, and so on. So they may explore that at this stage. It isn't really going to affect much what they put in the bill, but they're trying to give comfort to their political instructors.
So is this something that determines what amendments may be introduced in Parliament?
It doesn't determine it, but I try to anticipate helpfully for the government what it is the view is likely to be taken by the Speaker or the Chairman of a Public Bill Committee as to what is likely to be selected as being within scope or not. So
and why is that important?
Well, because from the government's point of view, take a rather distant example, when the government were thinking of introducing a bill to remove the remaining accepted hereditary peers from the House of Lords. And they were quite public about this 4 or 5 years ago, but I think they were advised that a bill, even a small bill like that, might be susceptible to amendment, whether passed or not, that dealt with other aspects of how the composition of the House of Lords. And the government may well have taken the view at that time that rather than risk having a bill that would then run for weeks and weeks and weeks, they wouldn't get away with it just being that single-purpose bill. So it might affect politically their judgment as to when to introduce a bill and what to put in it.
How do you work out what the scope of the bill is?
Reading it. There is no other magic to it. It's like, I guess, how you work out what a poem is about. The only way to do is to read it.
And what happens if there's uncertainty about the scope of a bill and what amendments may or may not be introduced? Who decides on that?
Well, in the House of Commons, and again the House of Lords has different arrangements. In the House of Commons, if it's on the floor of the House, so that's later stages of the bill, the Speaker will decide ultimately. And if it's during the committee stage, the Chairman of the Public Bill Committee, who is a quasi-Speaker, is appointed as a neutral judge. But he or she will obviously take advice from the clerks in the Public Bill Office, who will talk to the draftsmen, who are also seen as being extremely knowledgeable about what is not in the bill, and discussions then happen.
And do you advise also on matters affecting Parliament and its privileges?
Yes. Sometimes the government seems to proceed relatively unaware that Parliament is an institution in its own right, together with the monarchy and indeed the judiciary, and that maybe things have got into bills without anybody representing that this might have an unintended consequence for Parliament itself, which as part of the Constitution has to protect itself. But that's fairly rare.
Now, could I ask you to give us a brief outline of the stages which a bill goes through in Parliament before it becomes law?
Yes, and some of this is best illustrated by brief snippets photographically, although it's not particularly exciting. First of all, the bill is introduced, and that's to say introduction and first reading. It's a purely formal proceeding, as you'll see, where a whip says now and a day is named for second reading, and that's it. You can't protest, you can't vote against it, it has no effect at all. But that means it's then published and available to everybody, not just in Parliament, but on the website and widely and through the stationery office and so on.
Secretary Edward Miliband.
Energy Bill.
Second reading what day?
Monday next.
Monday next.
Then the big set-piece debate is at second reading, where the principle of the bill is discussed. Usually lasts a full 5 or 6 hours in the House of Commons, conventionally, and it's really a yes-no question. I mean, do you want the bill or don't you? And if there are bits of it you don't like and bits you do, a member really has to decide which way to vote. You can put down a reasoned amendment, but that really has to address the bill as a whole, and if it's passed, then that's fatal to the bill. In other words, you either say yes, and anything less than a yes is a no.
The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Energy Bill, second reading.
Now, the question is that the bill be now read a second time. Secretary Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time, and today is an appropriate day to be discussing the Energy Bill at the opening of the Copenhagen Conference and prior to the ministerial meetings in the second week of the conference.
But if, as is nearly always the case with government bills, because they obviously enjoy the support of the majority of members in the House, the bill gets a second reading. It then gets committed, which means it is sent to a committee, and there are two sorts of committee, either a committee of about 25 members that will then sit for weeks going through having debates on the bill in a committee room upstairs and amending it as it goes, line by line, clause by clause, or the committee of the whole House, which was an invention under the former Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century, partly as a way of getting the Speaker out of the chair. And it is chaired by a senior member, but it just takes place on the floor of the House. All members can take part, and the proceedings otherwise proceed exactly as if they're in a committee upstairs. And that happens in particular for constitutional bills, bills of great significance for some other reason, or sometimes for very short bills that can be raced through because there's no great opposition or controversy about it.
We now come to the main business. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Energy Bill not amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
Now.
Does first reading take place on the floor of the House?
First reading does take place to the extent it happens at all on the floor of the House, yes.
What happens after committee stage?
After the committee stage, the bill is reported to the House, and there's a stage called report or consideration, where the whole bill is again open up for discussion on the basis of amendments and new clauses, but rather more severely time limited, conventionally to about 4 or 5 hours. And so that it's a chance for big unresolved specific issues to be debated and to be voted on by the House as a whole, as opposed to having been voted on in the committee by a rather smaller, although representative, sample of members. And when that stage is over, in the House of Commons, we have third reading, which is usually less than an hour, on which effectively no amendment is possible, and which is a largely formal stage in which people have their last speeches on the bill and thank all the various people involved. And is a little less exciting in the Commons than sometimes in the Lords.
Third reading.
Now.
Mr. Secretary of State Miliband.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time. I want to thank members of the House for their contributions since second reading.
And how does a bill pass between Commons and Lords?
Well, it passes physically, rather surprisingly. In other words, it's wrapped up in, if it's sent from the Lords to the Commons, my colleagues there will wrap it up in a little bit of a red ribbon called ferret. And one of their table clerks, let's say one of the clerks, like myself with a wig and gown, will walk it down to the Commons and deliver it. And we will do the same in reverse. But of course, in practice, we have quite a lot of electronic devices to ensure the text pass seamlessly back and forth between the houses. And then it goes through, basically, almost exactly the same procedure in the second house. Politically different, and as you'll hear, some differences in practice. But basically, the same thing happens twice.